Hello out there in virtual learning land. This is another installment of macroeconomics video lessons. The purpose of this adventure is an investigation into how banks and thrifts create money. All right, so the modern banking system works on a fractional reserve banking system. Fractional reserve banking system. So, banking system which what? Banks' reserves are smaller than total deposits of customers at the bank, right? So, if you think about a bank, we'll call it ABC Bank in a small town. Let's say they have lots of customers and they have total deposits of $10 million. Well, if they were required to hold all of their deposits as reserves, they would not be able to loan out any of the deposits. If we had a 100% reserve requirement, it would be impossible for banks to create new monies. The fractional reserve banking system is the mechanism by which banks can create new monies by creating loans. So, banks create loans, money is created, loans are repaid, money is destroyed. So the fractional banking system is the economic tool by which banks are in a position to introduce new money into the economy. So the Federal Reserve sets the reserve requirement and holds reserves. Any bank or thrift that exists in the United States needs to be chartered with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve dictates what percentage of deposits banks are permitted to lend out, and therefore what percentage of deposits are required reserves. So if we go back in time to 1992, the required reserve in the United States was 12%. This is sometimes called the required reserve ratio. So let's go back to our little friend ABC Bank. ABC Bank has $10 million in deposits from its citizens who are in that particular area and have an account with that nice little old city bank or town bank, right? So if the bank has a required reserve ratio of 12%, that bank must keep $1,200,000 in reserve in cash in their vaults or on deposit at the Fed. Some combination of the two will work. The rest of it, which works out to be what? $8,800,000 is potential new money to be introduced in the economy when that bank creates a loan. Let's introduce a numeric example using bigger numbers to explain in a bit more detail the process of a single bank introducing new monies into the economy. So the first idea here is what's called what we call excess reserves. A bank is in a position to create new money, introduce new money into the economy when it is holding excess reserves. Matter of fact, when you teach monetary policy, it is important to emphasize that the Federal Reserve carries out monetary policy largely by affecting the amount of excess reserves that banks hold. Banks holding excess reserves can create new monies. Banks not holding excess reserves are not in a position to make additional loans and therefore cannot create new monies. So we have some numbers here. Let's continue with a fictitious bank. We'll call this bank XYZ. XYZ has $100 million in deposits from its customers in checkable deposits. Right now, there is $50 million in reserves, actual reserves at the bank. How much is the bank holding in excess reserves? Well, if the bank has taken in $100 million in checkable deposits, and the required reserve ratio is 10%. So in 1992, the Fed changed the required reserve ratio from 12% down to 10%. And it's been that way for an extremely long time. So the required reserve ratio is 10%. XYZ Bank has taken in $100 million from its customers. XYZ must hold 10% or 10 million in required reserves. But right now they only have 50 million. But the required reserve is based on their checkable deposits, not on their actual reserves. Now, it could be that actual reserves equal checkable deposits. That would say if the bank opened yesterday and they took in $100 million in deposits and they haven't made any loans yet, then their checkable deposits actually equal their actual reserves. But right now, this bank's been operating for a while. They're holding 50 million in actual reserves. Only 40 million of that is excess reserves. They have to keep that 10% of the 100 as required reserves. Therefore, XYZ Bank can lend out $40 million. XYZ is in a position to introduce $40 million of new monies into the economy. So banks have this conflicting goals. They obviously want to do number one, make a profit. And they make profits by loaning out money and charging interest. But they also profit from buying securities. Securities are bonds, right? And their capital requirements require them to have some bonds. So if a bank buys government bonds, they receive the interest from the bonds. And banks can also receive interest from the loans they create. But on top of that goal, number one, banks have another goal called number two, maintaining liquidity. That is to say, to make sure that they're in a position where when and if necessary, they can meet withdrawal demands. We know the required reserve ratio after 1992 was decreased from 12% to 10%. So what happens if a bank has a reserve shortfall? So let's stick with our good friends XYZ Bank. XYZ has $100 million from its depositors, from its customers, right, in checkable deposits. They are required to keep $10 million as required reserves. They can lend out 90. But what if they close the bank today? They find, oh no, we only have $9 million in reserves. We have a $1 million reserve shortfall. Well, XYZ can go into the overnight market, the Fed funds market, and borrow $1 million from another bank. So the Fed funds market is an overnight market where banks lend money to other banks when those banks are short on reserve requirements or required reserves. So you might think to yourself, well, why would another bank lend money to XYZ Bank? Well, because think of it this way. Let's say Wachovia, Wells Fargo they're now called, has plenty of reserves. They're holding lots of excess reserves. They're not going to make any money on the excess reserve tonight. Why not lend it to XYZ Bank and make something on the money? So our nation's central bank sets the Fed funds rate, and all other interest rates fall into place from this Fed funds rate. The Fed funds rate influences the 10-year Treasury, and the 10-year Treasury influences the prime rate, which influences mortgage rates, which influences interest rates on car loans and interest rates on student loans. So the Fed funds rate ultimately has a huge impact on economic activity because there's a lot of economic activity associated with interest rates. Now we will introduce an example which demonstrates how a single bank can increase the money supply, and further we will talk about this concept referred to as the money multiplier, which explains how the banking system, or how much the entire banking system, can expand the money supply through the loan process. So remember, excess reserves is simply actual reserves minus required reserves. Right? We covered that in a previous slide. Right? So we talk about required reserves, you simply take your checkable deposits, the amount of money deposited into the bank by customers times the reserve ratio. Now, this is the example used from the textbook. Not sure why McConnell Brew decided to use 20% when the actual reserve requirement in the economy is 10%. But notice down bottom here it says reserve ratio is 20%. So start off here with an example. It says, let's assume that there's $100,000 in checkable deposits in Bank A. How much money can Bank A create in new loans, and how much is required reserves? So if we simply take checkable deposits, 100,000 times 0.20, 20%, this bank has required reserves of $20,000, which means Bank A can create $80,000 in new loans. We're going to take this a step further and talk about the money creation process, not of a single bank, but of the entire banking system. This is referred to as the money multiplier. We're going to see step by step on the next slide using numbers. However, before we get to the next slide, we have to explain two important assumptions. Two important assumptions associated with the money creation ability of the entire banking system. The expansionary of the money supply that the banking system can create, and it's based on two assumptions. The first assumption is that banks lend out all of their excess reserves. So if a bank is holding excess reserves, they make loans. This is sometimes a reasonable assumption because that's how banks make money. The second assumption is that when a loan is created, when new money is introduced into the economy, that money makes its way immediately into another bank. All right, quick example. All right, Joe goes into a bank, borrows $5,000 to buy a used car, takes the $5,000, goes down to the car dealership, gives the car dealer the $5,000. Car dealer takes the $5,000, deposits it into his bank. All right, now that's money into the next bank, right? So those two assumptions. Number one, banks lend out all of their excess reserves, and new monies created immediately make their way into the banking system. Obviously, in the real world, these two assumptions will not be met. Remember, this is an introductory course, a survey course. The purpose of this exercise is to explain the theoretical idea called the money multiplier. So, to calculate the money multiplier, we take 1 over the required reserve ratio. In the previous example from the previous slide, McConnell Brew example from the textbook, they said, let's assume that the required reserve ratio set by the Federal Reserve is 20%. So 1 over 0.20 means that the money multiplier for that economy would be 5. Now, what if the required reserve ratio is the exact same as it is in the real world, 10%? Well, then we get a 1 over 0.10, which is 10. Now, why do we need this money multiplier? What is the purpose of the money multiplier? How do we use it? Notice here, we take the money multiplier. That big red arrow must mean something important, right? If we take the money multiplier that we calculated by using the required reserve ratio as our denominator, and we times it by the initial excess reserves held by a bank, we can then calculate the maximum money creation ability of the entire banking system. Here it says maximum checkable deposit creation. How much new monies the entire banking system can introduce into the economy. We can use the example from the McConnell Brew textbook to explain the concept of the money multiplier, which helps us understand the maximum checkable deposit increase or money increase, expansion of the money supply that the banking system can create. On the left-hand side, we have a list of banks, creatively called Bank A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, all the way down to Bank N, and then we have all the other banks, right? So let's start with Bank A. So Bank A has deposits of 100. Remember, in the McConnell Brew example, the required reserve ratio is 20%. Bank A must therefore hold $20 in required reserves, 20% of 100. Bank A is now in a position to lend out all of its excess reserves, which is 80% of 100. Bank A can create $80 worth of new loans. So on the left-hand side, it shows you the amount the bank can lend out and new money that bank can create. So remember, we're going to assume that banks lend out all of their excess reserves and that new loans are immediately redeposited into another bank. So Bank A makes a loan for 80 and it goes into Bank B. Bank B now has 80 in deposits. Bank B can lend out 80% of the 80, which is 64. They must keep 20%, 16 as reserve required. Ratio, right, required reserve. Bank B lends out all 64, and now Bank C has an increase in deposits of 64. Bank C can lend out 80% of 64, which works out to be 51.20, and must keep 20%, $12.80 in required reserves. Well, look, we could do this all day, right? Bank A, Bank B, Bank C, Bank D. When it's all said and done, how much can the banking system create when we tally bank by bank? 400. Now, isn't there a simpler way to come to that answer? Well, remember, from the previous slide, we introduced the formula. If we take the money multiplier and we multiply that by the amount of initial excess reserves, we can easily calculate the maximum expansion of the money supply which can be achieved by the entire banking system. That's the beauty of the money multiplier. So, what was the reserve requirement in this economy? 20%, which means 1 over the required reserve ratio, 1 over 20%, 1 divided by 0.2 equals 5. The money multiplier for this economy is 5. What are the initial excess reserves? The initial excess reserves are 80. Bank A had $100 in deposits. $80 worth of those deposits represent excess reserves. 5 times 80, look what happens. Lo and behold, we get to 400. Now remember, the money multiplier is a theoretical concept. It only works if two big assumptions actually take place, and that is, number one, banks lend out all of their excess reserves, which could be a reasonable assumption because banks make money by making loans, and all new monies are immediately redeposited into another bank. When a loan is created, that money makes its way into another bank. This little graph shows us the money creation process of a single bank and then the banking system. Same numbers from the previous example, but it's a good way to visualize the multiple money expansion the banking system can create, assuming we have a 20% required reserve ratio and a money multiplier of 5. So $100 in reserves represents $80 worth of new excess reserves. 5 times 80, which means the entire money supply can be increased by 400. When I was an undergraduate student studying economics, I learned that the required reserve ratio was 10%. I also learned that the required reserve ratio had been reduced from 12% to 10% in 1992. I was a decent undergraduate student, but I became keenly aware of trends in economics, discussion about monetary policy, and all issues related to the Federal Reserve when I began teaching macroeconomics after graduate school. At the time, every once in an economic blue moon, someone would bring up the topic of the required reserve ratio. 2008 was a good example when the financial crisis hit and the Fed was looking for ways to increase liquidity in the system. And some pundit suggested the Fed could reduce the required reserve ratio from 5%, from 10% to 5%, therefore increasing the expansionary power of banks through loan and money creation. Of course, the rebuttal to this proposal was to point out that the banks were the exact institutions that got us into this crisis to begin with. Why would we reduce their required reserve ratio? It seems rather irresponsible. Well, if you live long enough, you see almost everything. COVID-19 pandemic, something I never thought would ever be possible, and I'm still trying to get my theoretical head around this next idea I have to express. The Federal Reserve cut the required reserve ratio from 10% to 0%. Now, what does that mean in terms of the maximum increase in money supply powers of the banking system? What's the expansionary power of the banking system? How do we calculate the size of the money multiplier? We use our formula. 1 over the required reserve ratio allows us to calculate the size of the money multiplier. From 1992 till 2020, size of the money multiplier was easy to calculate. 1 over 0.1, the required reserve ratio in the U.S. economy as set by the Federal Reserve, 10%, which means there is a theoretical money multiplier of 10. Economists believe this was etched in stone. It shall be forever and forever it shall be. It will never change. Or at least that was the thinking. However, we just learned that because of the current coronavirus pandemic, the required reserve ratio has been cut to 0. What are the economic implications of a required reserve ratio of 0? Well, somewhere along your math education experience, you learned that division by 0 is undefined. Now you get into the technical reasoning behind that. Is you started with -1 or +1, and you tried to come closer to the point of origin. You took the limit of those numbers, yada yada yada. We don't have time or inclination to worry about that for the moment. All we know is division by 0 is undefined. So 1 over 0 gives us an undefined money multiplier. What does this mean in layman's terms? Here's what it means. It means that theoretically, the money multiplier is now infinitely large. In other words, the potential expansion powers of the banking system has no limit. That's what it means theoretically. Remember, this is an introductory survey course. Perhaps you will take the course on financial institutions and banking at some point in the future, and you will investigate such real-life applications of this economic theory that happen when not all excess reserves are loaned out, and how banking policies and what we would say was typical bank behavior has changed now that the Fed pays interest on excess reserves. Or you might investigate leakages in the system when a bank makes a loan but the monies don't get immediately redeposited into the next bank, and on average what percentage of that takes place. For now, you understand the theory. One over the required reserve ratio gives us the money multiplier. Given a certain amount of excess reserves, we take the money multiplier, times that by the initial excess reserves, we get the maximum checkable deposit creation of the entire banking system. It will be interesting to see how Fed policy changes forced by this horrific virus ultimately impact the banking system. For now, you've been introduced to the fractional reserve system, the idea of actual reserves, excess reserves, and required reserves, and the economic theory behind money creation of a single bank and the potential power of money creation of the banking system. Good luck and see you in future videos.